Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall, and we're doing nonfiction in the month of November to commemorate Nonfiction November, a great BookTube event that I'm sure you don't need any introduction, that concentrates on nonfiction. It gets you to pull down some nonfiction from your shelves, give it more of a chance, maybe bump it up in your reading roster. I myself read a huge amount of nonfiction, always have. I love it dearly. For the month of November, I am shifting around my percentages just a bit so that the amount of nonfiction that I read goes up percentage-wise even more. And the amount of fiction that I read just for the month of November is going way down. And that's okay. I tend to do that every year, certainly since Nonfiction November, since I first became aware of Nonfiction November. The problem is bumping the fiction ratio back up at the end of November, but I will manage to do that. So for November, we are concentrating for this daily Penguin dose on some of the nonfiction that's on my shelf. And today, today was inevitable, of course. This particular piece of nonfiction has come into vogue in the year 2020 for just about the worst imaginable reason. This is Journal of Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. This Penguin Classic has an introduction by Anthony Burgess, a great practitioner of my own art, in addition to being a great novelist and a middling great composer. His essay here, I won't say it's embarrassing to compare it with other Penguin Classic introductions, but it shows a marked difference in talent level. You get a well-meaning and extremely well-informed academic to churn out a 10-page introduction to something or other. It's going to read exactly like that. Burgess spent the whole of his adult life writing for money, for the enjoyment of editors and audiences, bringing a huge amount of erudition and readability to virtually every piece that he wrote. And this is no exception. His introduction stands so far above most of the introductions that we have talked about in this March of the Penguins. I believe this little discussion of his of Journal of the Plague Year is also in one of his collections that I have. But it's great to have it paired with this book. The only problems I have with this volume are this is a rare Penguin Classic of mine that is obviously secondhand. I mean, I got this used, but it's got markings on the front, it's got markings on some of the pages, and the markings aren't careful annotations of a type that don't bother me. They're instead the bored jottings of a student. I need a new edition of this work, but I'm really reluctant to give up the Burgess introduction. And I don't know, I'm sure that Penguin makes a new edition of this, but I have no idea if it has that introduction. I kind of like the pairing, although it isn't necessary because I'm pretty sure I have the introduction elsewhere. But this is about London in 1665. This is about the great visitation of the year 1665 of the plague. And the reason why it is in vogue in 2020 is fairly obvious, because we are dealing with a pandemic, with a worldwide infection, a new virus that has attacked the human race everywhere and has exposed the weaknesses of human societies to deal with such things. They aren't very different in terms of their nature than the weaknesses of the London that Defoe describes here. Humans are terrible at collective action unless that collective action is either warfare or dispossessing the most vulnerable members of society. Those two things humans can do collectively very easily and very often, but following changing behavior according to a new set of circumstances is always an elephantinely slow process. And every pundit in the world, every cheesy commentariat member has hauled out this book as if they were the very first person to think about the parallel. So I have read 80 million pieces that sententiously evoke this work in order to talk about COVID-19, and I am sure that it is going to feature prominently in books in 2021. 2021 is going to be the great autopsy year for the publishing industry. That's when we will get an absolute flood of books about Donald Trump, in amounts to make the amount we've seen so far look trivial. And that is also when we will get an absolute flood of books about COVID-19. probably be right there on the front barricades to deal with both of those floods. But I'm sure that every one of those books is going to bring this up. How could they not? They could not. They could try not to. This is this is a weird book, and Burgess does a great job of letting you know ahead of time what the weirdness is going to be like. Defoe was a weird guy, and has only had one modern biography that I know of that even remotely scratches the surface of how weird he was. He led an absolutely fascinating life, tried everything under the sun, and only came to writing books in his 50s. So those of you out there who are in your 40s, or maybe you are peering into your 50s and don't feel like you've accomplished much, well, the author of Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe didn't start until he was in his 50s. So you've got that going for you. And he wrote this book. He published this book in 1722, the same year that he published Moll Flanders, and just a little bit after he'd done Robinson Crusoe. Excuse me. And you don't have to be all that conversant with the actuarial tables of the reign of King Charles II to do the math on that and realize that unless Daniel Defoe lived to be 200, there's something off about the chronology of this if the plague was in 1665. And you're right. He was a child when these events took place. And although this book purports to be a first-hand narrative, it's told in the first person by a person who stays in London throughout the whole of the Great Visitation. It can't possibly be Daniel Defoe as the I who is the narrator of this book, which has led to very Defoe-style confusion as to genre and type and what kind of an animal this thing is. The inscription that always accompanies the work, HF, is widely taken to be Henry Foe. The family's name was Foe before Daniel Defoe added the DE to it. And Henry Foe did stay in London. He was an uncle of Daniel Defoe, and he did stay in London the whole time of the plague and told many, many stories. So it's probably that there's some sort of historical, biographical, family legacy channeling going on here. There's also a huge amount of imagination and a huge amount of very scrupulously employed factual and medical details throughout here, which makes it a wonderfully unclassifiable novel that is incredibly gripping reading. The thing that it shares in common with pretty much everything else that Daniel Defoe wrote is that it is absolutely meant to grab you by the lapels and not let you go until it's done with its stories, and it does that. It absolutely does that. I don't know how many of you are all that familiar with Moll Flanders. Probably quite a few of you are familiar, at least in some bowdlerized version, with Robinson Crusoe. And I guarantee, unless you are a student of Defoe's period or a student of him, there are going to be 10 or 12 works of his that you have no familiarity with whatsoever. This is always a weird thing. It crops up from time to time on this March of the Penguins, where we will come across an author that I think was great in everything that he wrote pen to, but who is known for only a tiny fraction of what he wrote. I granted, a lot of what he did was extremely topical, so you would need an introduction and notes to really pull their weight, but such things do exist. They can be made to happen. But one way or another, this book recounts endless amounts of stories of the great plague of 1665. On a personal level, on a social level, what people did, what they said, vignettes that come alive and that we have absolutely no reason to think didn't actually happen, regardless of their means of transmission. It's very similar to having a whole book of Samuel Pepys on this plague. It's very similar to that because they have the same lively prose style, they have the same omnivorous wandering eye and insatiable curiosity about everything, and they also have the same flawless instinct for the human element of any story, which makes their stories evergreen. So I confess, as trite as it is, and as much as I have mocked other members of my own profession, I have revisited this work in 2020. There was no way not to. My only saving grace is that I haven't then foisted my stupid cod philosophizing on my readers. Plenty of people that I know in my own profession have not. They have not been able to resist that temptation. But I did go back to this book. There's no way not to. There's no way not to go back to it when you know the resonances that it's going to have. Because it's one thing to read and sympathize. It's another thing to read and empathize. To read and say, okay, I feel sorry for the people in this narrative, and also I know exactly what they're going through because I myself am going through it. We are going through it. I'm making this video, for instance, in the United States. And the United States is absolutely awash in COVID-19. We're not talking hotspots anymore. It's awash in this particular 2020 plague. Thousands of cases every day, on track to hundreds of thousands of cases every day. Mortality rates lagging behind because therapeutics, because the medical community's approach to this, even without any kind of a miracle vaccine, has improved over the course of the year. But still, when those death numbers are going to go up steeply, just like the case numbers are going up, I don't know why at this point any country in the world accepts travel from the United States. We are absolutely teeming with this pandemic. Massachusetts numbers that were so good for so long, going up. Numbers everywhere going up. And a real sense that this has only just begun, that this ordeal has only just begun. A real sense that the widespread number of communities in Republican states or in small towns that have just ignored this. Well, we're not going to, no, there's no mask mandate. There's no 6 feet, social distancing mandate. Our libraries, our theaters, our stores, our malls, they'll all be open just like normal. Once upon a time, in the spring and in some parts of the summer, huge swaths of the country were like that. And now those swaths of the country are much, much smaller and are islands under siege. And the idea, the feeling, the real feeling is that sooner or later, if you paint the country red with COVID, sooner or later it's just going to be a flat, uniform red from start to finish, from one end to the next. Without any of those communities, whether they're Republican, whether they're small, whether they're extremely ingrown or science denying, without any of those communities being able to do anymore what they have done all along, which is to say, well, you must be doing something wrong. This is some sort of elite coastal thing, because life here is just normal. Now, that's not how viruses work. They don't care about such things. They just propagate. Until they have filled every space on a map, they just propagate. Unless they're brought to heel. And in the United States right now, there is no federal response. The minor, half-hearted federal response to a national problem. A national problem. I ordinarily don't advocate for federal responses to anything, except if you have a national problem. As has often been pointed out, it wasn't the territory of Hawaii that struck back at the Empire of Japan after Pearl Harbor. It wasn't the state of California that went to war with Nazi Germany. This is one of those crises, and our federal government has just thrown up its hands. It made a few passing gestures at the very beginning, March, April, and May, but has done nothing since in any way whatsoever. No nationalizing of resources to deal with this, no national plan, no nothing like that. And certainly no national financial relief. A tiny fraction, a drop in the bucket of what people and businesses and communities need. A tiny drop in the bucket. So there's no reason to believe that those numbers that we're awash in, up to our eyeballs in, I forget what the permutation numbers were, but they're staggering. It's something like 1 in 1,000 Americans has now been affected by this, down from very recently when that was 1 in 900,000. And sooner rather than later, it will be that everyone has been directly affected by this, that everyone has had it or knows someone who had, that everyone knows somebody who has lost someone or lost a business or something like that. And oddly enough, that it's scandalous. It's odd and ironical and utterly scandalous, but that sorry state of affairs really does draw parallels between now and the England of Charles II, where you're reading this book. When the experience of reading this book, it's harrowing, but it is page turning, and you're reading it and you're automatically looking at parallels. Well, okay, what did quite apart from all of the heartbreaking personal stories that Defoe tells in this book, what did the government of King Charles II do about this thing that was happening? What did they do? What were their policies? What were their approaches to it? It's fascinating to make the parallels. Your mind can't help but do it. I don't know why. I should have avoided rereading this book, but nevertheless, I am hoping somewhere down the line, this is a keeper. This is a repeat book for me, far more so than a lot of Defoe's more famous books. So I'm hoping down the line somewhere that I will get a nicer copy of this. I keep this and go back to it just because it's on my shelf. I've had it for years. I've had it for 10 years. But I could stand for this particular copy to be better, to be in better shape. And I want to read you a passage here, just an idea of the specifics into which Defoe can go. The type of specifics that crop up over and over again in this book, and that really do encourage you to forget that these are not his own personal observations. That is fascinating, the way he inhabits the daily life, the outraged sympathies of someone who was actually there when he was not. This is about the disease itself. Those of you who are a little squeamish should brace yourself, because the disease itself caused a swelling in the lymph node system. Buboes, these bulging sacs would develop in the armpits, in the groin, and sometimes they wouldn't, and the person would just keel over and die. Or sometimes those things would develop, but they weren't necessarily, for some people, incapacitatingly painful, so the person would just carry on until the disease killed them. But this is Defoe going on about some variations of those. The pain of the swelling was in particular very violent, and to some intolerable. The physicians and surgeons may be said to have tortured many poor creatures even to death. The swellings in some grew hard, and they applied violent drawing plasters or poultices to break them. And if these did not do, they cut and scarified them in a terrible manner. In some of those swellings were hard partly by the force of the distemper and partly by their being too violently drawn, and were so hard that no instrument could cut them. And then they burnt them with caustics, so that many died raving mad with the torment, and some in the very operation. In these distresses, some, for want of help to hold them down in their beds or to look to them, laid hands upon themselves, as above. I'm going to read you the part that he's referring to. Some broke out into the streets, perhaps naked, and would run directly down to the river if they were not stopped by the watchmen or other officers, and plunge themselves into the water wherever they found it. It often pierced my very soul to hear the groans and cries of those who were thus tormented. But of the two, this was counted the most promising, particular in the whole infection. For if these swellings could be brought to a head, and for them to break and run, or, as the surgeon calls it, to digest, the patient generally recovered. Whereas those who, like the gentlewoman's daughter, were struck with death at the beginning, and had the tokens come out upon them, often went about indifferent, easy, till a little before they died, and some till the moment they dropped down, as in apoplexies and epilepsies is often the case. Such would be taken suddenly very sick, and would run to a bench or bulk or any convenient place that offered itself, or to their own houses if possible, as I mentioned before, and there sit down, grow faint, and die. This kind of dying as much the same as it was with those who die of common mortifications, who die swooning, and, as it were, go away in a dream. Such as died thus had very little notice of their being infected at all, till the gangrene was spread throughout their whole body, nor could physicians themselves know certainly how it was with them, till they opened their breasts or other parts of the body and saw the tokens. And the incident, people just deciding to kill themselves because the torment was too great, is related in Bell Alley. Just in Bell Alley, on the right-hand side of the passage. Look at all the details that Defoe did not see. And yet we can be sure that they were true. It's like Burgess says in his introduction, this is a work that is widely considered a novel and also widely regarded as history. Just in Bell Alley, on the right-hand side of the passage, there was a more terrible cry than that, though it was not so directed out at the window, but the whole family was in a terrible fright, and I could hear women and children run screaming about the rooms like distracted people, when a garret window opened and somebody from a window on the other side of the alley called and asked, "What is the matter?" Upon which, from the first window, it was answered, "O Lord, my old master has hanged himself." The other asked again, is he quite dead? And the first answered, aye, quite dead and cold. This person was a merchant and a deputy alderman, and very rich. I care not to mention the name, though I knew his name too, but that would be a hardship to the family, which is now flourishing again. Notice the up and down nature of the narrative, how you get the horrific details. You get a bit of humor, just a touch of it, and you also get that the personal knowledge gossip at the end, that he was an alderman. I don't want to mention his name. It might affect his family. It really hit them hard, although they're flourishing now. That rhythm, those of you who have read The Diary of Samuel Pepys will find it very familiar, because Pepys does the same thing. He captures the same way that the mind rushes along on a subject like that, from the wide scale to the small scale and back again, from the relevant to the irrelevantly personal and then back again. That happens all throughout this book. And it'll move you. And it'll move you more now, unfortunately, in 2020 than it would have moved you in 2019. I know that's a little grotesque and a little macabre, but I might also point out, obviously your Penguin Classic for today is a recommend. I might also point out that those kinds of parallels really aren't gruesome. They really aren't ghoulish. Some of my colleagues in the commentariat profession have made it that way by being opportunistically pompous about this book. But the connections themselves are not anything to be ashamed of. There's no reason to be ashamed of grabbing this book and reading A Journal of the Plague Year during a plague year. If anything, it will make you appreciate this book more. It will make it a more lively and more personal reading experience. So I actually do encourage the consolation that this book can give you. Such as it is, the consolation that this book can give you. That not so much that things will be better, especially if you're in the United States. If you're in the United States, I think we have a long haul to go. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better. So not so much the promise that things will get better as just the promise of an electrically affecting reading experience. More affecting than it would have been without that, the raw circumstances just being there. That is the kind of personal identification, the kind that I often mock when young people say, well, I didn't see anyone in this book that was named Marcy, and my name is Marcy, so this is a stinky book. There's no one in it I could identify with, because there's no one in it who looks and acts and sounds and lives exactly like I do. That kind of identification I mock, that kind of entitled 21st century self-absorption. This kind of identification is quite different than that. This is an experience we're all going through. And Defoe recounts it so vividly that you'll actually think he went through it himself. So your Penguin Classic for today is a recommend. It's a grim recommend, but it's a recommend. And I'm trying not to plan too far ahead, although I am grabbing only nonfiction for your Daily Penguin. But I'm going to try to pick something a little more lighthearted tomorrow. So don't worry, it won't be grim 2 days in a row. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.